Seldom will you find me more relaxed than I am right now, because we're doing this portion of our little corner in my river room, which I've made kind of infamous by talking about it on this program and on my newspaper column for years. It's a comfortable location on the back of our house at 1921 Route 22B in Morrisonville, and it's just a few inches from the Saranac River. And we're doing this on President's Day 2002, right, Calvin?
That's absolutely right,
I
Gordy.
expected you to put your tall hat and your beard on and come in dressed as Abe, but
I'm more of the George Washington type.
are you? you're more of a Teddy Roosevelt type to me. The older you get, the more you're looking. I think you've got to bring a teddy bear with you.
That's reminds me of one of my favorite movies, Arsenic and Old Lace.
Oh, my.
The guy blowing the bugle there.
But it is a beautiful sunshiny day on the 18th day of February 2002, and we decided to do another retrospective. As they say on television and on the radio, back by popular demand.
We did get a very positive response. We had a lot of positive response in that retrospective #1, and we're doing another one fairly quickly here because we're covering the first couple of years of this show that's been going on for almost 5 years now, Gordy.
Yeah.
And I thought one reason we ought to do it soon, because we won't be so apt to repeat what we said in the first one if we do it fairly soon after the first one.
There's an insinuation there, and a very accurate one, I might say, because it's hard for us to remember what we talked about last time. But you know what I find fascinating about going back and remembering is when you read the list, I'm kind of overwhelmed by how many different topics we've covered and how many places we've visited and how many wonderful stories people have told us. It's kind of neat to look back, isn't it?
Yes, and you know it's a challenge, and it's a great challenge to keep coming up with new and fresh ideas. As we're taping this, showing up here in Plattsburgh this weekend, and we're not going to talk about our current shows because we're going to talk about the old ones, but we have a show that's been highly praised when it was shown up in the Champlain area, and that's the Adirondack Wood Turner with Kenneth Gadway. And you never know where these ideas and stories are going to come from. I just happened to pick up a little paper called the Lake Champlain Weekly, and there was a story on Kenneth Gadway, and the next thing you know, we were there. It's great. You know, we both keep our eyes and ears open, and so far we haven't run out of stories to tell.
And there are so many more. And every time I sit down with a group, I remind them, and they remind me by reciprocating, that everybody has a story. And we love to find those people, and that's why we always encourage our friends and people who are not yet our friends to let us know if they have a topic that they think we ought to cover. Before we started the cameras today, I mentioned one-room schoolhouses. We've alluded to them in our programs before, but I had a wonderful telephone call from a lady last night who turned out to be Skinny Dagenaw's sister, the late Roger Dagnaw, beloved Justice of the Peace for 40-some years, and she's got a tremendous story to tell about the Peru school system. Having spent the first 8 grades of her life in a one-room schoolhouse, the building still exists, albeit it's a bit run down between here and Peru. And what a great topic. If we could ever get some of the old school teachers before we lose them, and a few of their students, we could tell a real story, couldn't we?
Well, we just had one recently. Again, we don't want to talk about our current shows, but we just had one recently when we did the 1922 Montgomery Ward's catalog. We talked to a one-room schoolroom teacher. And a few years back, I almost think her name was Gadway too, but that'd be too much coincidence because we just talked about Kenneth Gadway. But there was a lady who died in her 90s who taught at the one-room schoolhouse in Merrill, which is, I believe, still used as a voting place up for the people in Ellenberg.
The name was Gadway?
I believe. And
Wally Gadway, the late Wally Gadway from Morrisonville, also taught in a one-room schoolhouse. So how about that, eh?
Yeah, and one-room schoolhouses, although I never went to one, have always been on my mind because I lived next door to the site of a one-room schoolhouse when my father was growing up. Immediately adjacent to our home where I now live and where I grew up and where he grew up was a one-room schoolhouse. In fact, that small lot with the one-room schoolhouse is what prevents my property from being a perfect rectangle, because that little area is taken off in there. So the schoolhouse was long gone when I was there, but the cement structure for it was always there, and we'd play around there. And that house still exists. It's up on Honeymoore's Corners. It's a home now. And when I was growing up, also, I used to go to my cousin's house, the late Carol Bayshard, Carol Wallet,
Yep.
and on her father's farm. Again, not part of the farm, but it's still owned by the school district, even though the farm is no longer in the Bayshard family. It's in the Tatro family now, but was a one-room schoolhouse, and it still was there, and it didn't get torn down probably till the 1970s. So, now, one-room schoolhouses have always been kind of on my mind, and I'm fascinated by them.
Well, we're going to have to do a retrospective on one-room schoolhouses before we lose all those people who went to those and who taught at those. Another one, because it's such an interesting topic. My childhood, I never went to a one-room schoolhouse, but I did go to a couple of two-room schoolhouses. Same concept. Wonderful, interesting part of education, and I'm so delighted to see that on the internet now, besides preserving the memories of veterans, which is something you and I have been very close to for a long time, there are efforts afoot around our country to preserve those stories of one-room schoolhouses. You can get on a website, a little click of your mouse, and listen to a little old lady who taught in a one-room schoolhouse out in Michigan or Minnesota way back in the early part of the 20th century, and it's neat to actually hear those stories. So we always encourage youngsters to get the stories of their fathers and grandfathers and great-grandmothers, and this lady that called me last night, for example, that went to the little schoolhouse near Peru, said her grandchild asked her about going to school in a one-room schoolhouse, and then hardly could believe the story she told, because it seems so far removed from today.
Yeah, well, we all see examples of it when we watch particularly reruns of Little House on the Prairie or some of those shows. You see examples of one-room schoolhouse. And the Minor Institute in Chazy tries to keep that alive, because they've got miners. The house, the little one-room schoolhouse that William H. Minor went to, is now a little red building up there by the college at the corners where Minor Institute is, and they invite school students in there, and they conduct a one-room schoolhouse for educational purposes for the kids throughout the spring and fall, and in Willsboro, I know the 1812 Homestead runs a one-room schoolhouse. When the kids go there to look around, they try to show them what life was like in 1812, and part of it is the one-room school. So there are opportunities for youngsters to learn about these one-room schools, and again, if we can find the people who are actually there, it's like the show we did last week with some more World War II vets. It's not like getting it secondhand. When you get it firsthand, it's that much more important, and you can preserve it, and that's great.
Well, let that be a lesson to some of our viewers if they have information about one-room schoolhouses, and I know a few people that do have old photographs and so on. Let us know at any time by calling Calvert at Hometown Cable, 298-4663, and giving him a little tidbit of information, and we'll be glad to run with it. That's what we do.
Yeah, and another thing we talked about this morning while we were setting up my tripod here is talking about the old dairies. I know in Champlain we had the Sunny Hill Dairy, and up here we talked about Bayview and Rosebud and Plattsburgh Dairy. Maybe there's a nice story to be told about the old dairies before some of those dairy owners are gone. So maybe if people out there know about the dairies, have pictures or bottles or whatever, maybe we can get together and do a little story on the dairies in the area.
We collect little tidbits of information. You and I have discussed a number of topics that we'd like to cover, and we're opportunists because we are busy. We may be old, I speak for myself here, but we're busy, and when an opportunity arises and somebody gives us a little bit of information, we say, what are you doing about 2 o'clock this afternoon or 4 o'clock Sunday, and we go over there and do the program. And the ones that are off the wall have been the most fun, but it always pleases me when people walk up and say, I love your show. And then they always bring up 2 or 3 of their favorites, don't they?
Yeah.
And somebody almost accosted me in the Morrisonville post office a few days ago, a gentleman I wasn't familiar with, except that he is now a friend because he talked about our programs. The ones he liked the best were the 9 shows we did with Ron Venn. Talk about retrospective, the now and then, or the then and now photographs. And he said, I never get tired of seeing the old photographs and see what it looks like today.
Yeah, Ron Venn has certainly been a find. I'm not sure if he's going to be one of the ones we're talking about.
But who
We
knows?
didn't get to him until 2000, so we may not get that far today.
So what do you want to talk about, Calvin?
Well, we're going to start with this random list that we started on last time. We got probably about 40% of the way through it the last time, so maybe we can finish it up this time. If not, we'll carry on at Chapter 3.
Of course.
Well, we're going to start with, I thought was a very exciting scene. This program opened with Gordy Little at the piano, kind of going wild, but we were soon to find out that it was a Plier piano. And we were in the studios of the piano man, Art Pierce, your friend.
My good friend Art Pierce, a guy who's shown up on at least 2 and maybe 3 of our programs in the past. You know, Art Pierce is an icon in this area. He's been here for a long, long time, although he's not even a native of New York State, mind you. But when he came here back in the 1940s, he soon made a name for himself with this tremendous deep voice on the radio at WEAV, and that's where I first met him. Art then moved over to WIRY before I did, and he was established there for a long time. And after he worked at Wiry, then he went to work at a brand new radio station called WKDR for a while and did news there. And then he left the radio business altogether. As charming as the radio business may be for some of our viewers and many of our listeners, it's a very demanding business, as you know, day after day after day. It doesn't pay a great deal of money to those people who get into it. You do it because you love it, but it's generally a 6 and 7 day a week job and doesn't leave your mind very easily. As our viewers know, I worked on the radio for 36 years. I've been out of the radio business for very close to 5 years now, but never a day goes by that I don't think about it, and it occupies my dreams at night as I try to fix equipment that won't work on a remote site or whatever. But Art and I shared a great deal of that. But back in the early 1960s when we worked together at Wiry, one night Art said to me, you know, Gordy, I wish I had a letterhead, a logo, a picture for my letterhead, because I fix player pianos and tune pianos. And so, as you know, I like to doodle. And so I doodled one day when I was on the radio in the old Wiry studios and made a picture of a really surrealistic looking piano with a curved keyboard. It's a strange looking thing, but you would say, a child would say, that's a piano.
Uh-huh.
He copied that and has used it as his letterhead ever since.
So you get residuals every week?
Yeah, sure. All the old piano rolls I can eat. But Art and I have been friends for so long, and I wouldn't be telling tales out of school if I mentioned that Art came very close to knocking on death's door a few years ago, and his late wife Blanche stood by him, went back and forth to Burlington and helped him recover from his open heart surgery, and it was touch and go. But you know what? The angels up there were hovering over Arthur, brought him back, and his big, strong voice isn't as big and strong as it used to be, but he goes to work every day in A.E. Pierce Piano Workshop and fixes those pianos. And every time he gets a new one in, he calls and says, Gordy, come on over. I want you to see this. And generally speaking, they're ancient machines.
Yeah.
And there aren't very many people on this earth who would even try to tackle fixing those. So he's got a captive audience.
Well, one of the nice things about the stories that we do is that nobody ever lives in a vacuum, and when you're doing the Art Pierce story, you're also touching on so many other things. And one of the things he told us about Was that Orchestrion? Is that how you
The
pronounce
Orchestrion. Oh, what a story.
from the Minor Farm? And were you part of the crew that went and picked that up out of
I
there?
was absolutely a part of the crew. They were wrecking the building up there that the Orchestrion was located in.
I think it was Harmony Hall, but I'm not sure.
It was absolutely Harmony Hall. They had built an entertainment center. You and I would put a stereo system with surround sound in today. Back in those days, they built a room about this giant orchestrion. The orchestrion being a glorified player piano that not only played the piano, but it played the violin. And I don't know if it had a trumpet.
I think it had horns, too.
And horns, and these giant pipes that went down into the basement. And long story short, Art didn't want to see it destroyed, and neither did I. So he bid on it and got it. I don't know if he paid $1 or $10, but he and I and a former sheriff from Clinton County got a flatbed truck and went up there and took that thing apart. They only gave us a very short time to do it. Thank goodness every part in this German-made, beautiful precision instrument had been marked in old ancient script. And so we took it apart, lovingly but quickly, loaded it on that flatbed truck and delivered it to Art's beautiful Victorian mansion. The house still exists on Macomb Street in Plattsburgh, and carried every one of those parts upstairs. And believe me, there were thousands of parts to that thing upstairs. And he worked, well, Art told us on the show, I can't remember if it was a year, but it was a long time, restored that orchestrion. And before he ever had the beautiful cover on it, it was just the insides. He had it set up. And if any of our viewers have ever seen a piano roll, you know what they look like. These rolls were gigundous. They were huge. And he fired that thing up, and it sounded so great. And it's that orchestrion itself became a world traveler. Spent a brief period of time in the Smithsonian, where my family and I went down and were blown away when I walked in, and here's Art Pierce's orchestrion. God knows where it ended up. It's somewhere out west right now. Art could tell the story, but this is just one tiny piece of Art's life, and I don't think we mentioned it while we interviewed Art, but I want the viewers to know now that Art was at one time a fantastic watercolor artist. When I first met him, he showed me watercolors that he had done. As many of our viewers know, Art is albino, so albino means you don't have much pigment in your eyes and your skin, and so he's so tuned in to bright lights and cold weather and so on. So if you see Art, he'll wear these half gloves all the time. It's very, very difficult, and it's caused him problems over the years, to the point where when he was on the radio, he had to read script right close to his face, like the late Ben Everest, who lost the sight of one eye in a terrible accident. Art couldn't see very well, and he had a special light, and he had to hold the script very close to his eyes. How Arthur can repair those player pianos with that eyesight is even more interesting and exciting to me. And how this guy could do artwork when he could barely see is beyond what you can even believe. And I don't think he told us about the watercolor.
No, we didn't. I'm sure we didn't talk about the watercolor at all. So,
but he has little player pianos, big player pianos, grand pianos, the whole 9 yards. Really great. Art Pierce, what a good friend.
Yep. Okay, next, a story that, as we're taping this, would have been probably a big story a couple months ago. And that's the U.S. Immigration Service, with all the problems we've had since 9/11, and now all of a sudden the Immigration and the Customs Service are finally getting some new help. They're hiring people, and this was a very interesting story. Dick McCabe, the director of the local immigration, and several of his people, and I don't want to start mentioning them because I'll mention a couple and not mention the other couple, and but from Dick McCabe on down, they get a fascinating story on U.S. immigration.
We enjoyed being there so much. I mean, you and I have known many people who worked in that business and still do for the Border Patrol and the Immigration Service. The late Bob Venn worked
Bob worked for Customs.
For U.S. Customs.
People don't realize that they're two entirely different entities, and they work for different branches of the government. Customs is actually part of the Treasury Department, because back in 1789, the cry went out that revenue must be had, and that's when they started the Customs Service, and that's how, for the most part, the government was funded, was through the money from imports and exports and what have you. But immigration is an entirely different ball of wax, and when you come through the port, most of us don't know the difference whether we're talking to an immigration inspector or a custom inspector, because they'll alternate. They each have their own little turns out there. And but immigration is, of course, obviously worried about people coming through, and and people like the Border Patrol worries about both, I guess, because they worry about people and about smuggling goods or people.
You know, it's so interesting because every time we do that, it adds to our own education. We go in and we interview these people who showed us from the inside how they can tell when something is fake, when they got a bad passport or a bad license or a bad ID. They went through that whole process, and they showed us some bogus ones and showed us the difference. Not that you and I would ever be able to tell ourselves, but they're very good at it.
Yeah, and of course that's going to be the next several years. We'll definitely have to go back. We'll do a follow up on both the customs and the immigration, because through the efforts spearheaded by the local Chamber of Commerce, there's going to be some changes made there, and some of those might have been made anyway. But I don't think it would have happened as rapidly or as extensively without the effort that Gary Douglas put in there.
I was just going to mention Gary Douglas has taken this as his own personal gauntlet, which he picked up and ran with. And if anybody is familiar with things that happen here in the greater Plattsburgh area in Clinton County, they know Gary Douglas spent a lot of time at that border saying, we got to do something up here. And he's been a very good spokesman toward that end.
And he's gotten Gary worked, it was mentioned in the last episode we did in this retrospective, Gary worked for Gerald Solomon, Congressman Solomon, for many years before moving up here to take this job with the Chamber. So he knows the ins and outs of government. But he's been very good at getting the ear of our senators, not just Congressman McHugh, who we would expect to be in tune with us, but also the senators have jumped on, particularly Schumer.
Absolutely. So we learned a great deal when we were up there that day. They took us inside and outside the buildings. We've seen the drug-sniffing dogs at work, and we've covered that whole thing from the inside out. And it's amazing that things do go that smoothly when people from our area, especially a guy like Calvin who lives just a very, very short distance from the border, makes that sometimes several times a week.
Oh, well, no. Well, during the summer when I go up to Montreal, I might, maybe some weeks that I go several times a week, but, it's still a hassle to go back and forth to Canada. I can call it a hassle, but it's inconvenience. So, you don't find yourself just wandering across.
Oh, no, you don't wander across. You got to talk to somebody.
No, but I mean, you just don't make little trips unless you have a reason to go across there, because it's not like driving from Morrisonville to Plattsburgh. You still got to account to where you're going and why you were there. And
not too many people live on an international border crossing, and people who live here don't stop to think how big that border crossing is between the United States and Canada, and that was pointed out to us that day.
Oh, a lot of dead end roads that were once very active highways now have to be watched very closely, but Border Patrol is mainly in charge of those. The immigration is active at the active ports.
It's another thing. You and Bob did a program, I think, on prohibition, didn't you, one time?
We did.
Talk about the border?
Yeah, we did 2 fantastic shows on prohibition, and we did one where we sat down in the Knights of Columbus in Champlain and talked to Frank Monette, Ed Favreau, and my uncle Orville Tremblay. And then about a year and a half later, 2 years later, we did a follow-up where we took these same gentlemen and we had We borrowed a limousine from Garcel's limousine service. They donated it to us, and Leo Neverett, the late Leo Neverett, offered his services to drive us around, and we sat in that limo and drove to the actual sites that these guys had talked about. And
Did you really?
relive
Oh,
those
my.
memories? So there's two fantastic stories there, and it's a story I wish that we'd tried to. Well, actually, we had tried for quite a while to get these people to talk, but so many of them were reluctant to talk because although it's romanticized now, they were still outlaws. Let's face it. You know,
Of course
they were
they
still
were.
breaking the law,
Yeah.
and they were just a little reluctant to talk about it at first. But we finally got them old enough where they figured they
Yeah,
could
what do we
relax
got to
and
lose
talk
now,
about
right?
it. And there was we just touched the surface there because there's so many families. Well, in my neck of the woods in Champlain, but all along the border, that were involved with it. And I know at my house where I live, my father tells a story of the bootleggers pulling in, hiding in the hay barn, hiding stuff, under the floors.
Kate's
and so
father
on.
told similar stories about Altona and Jericho.
Yeah, so
Great.
there's just, and it's unfortunate that we don't have more of that recorded, but we can certainly thank Alan Everest for the effort he did with Rum Across the Border to help preserve
Oh,
that
absolutely.
in literature.
Yep.
Next is Dragoons Farm Equipment Open House. This is something back when Bob Ben and I first started doing What's Going On Here. One of the first places I told Bob we got to do, because we started doing it in the spring, was the open house with Dragoons Farm Equipment. And Bob and I kept on that tradition. We did 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, nine of
Did
them.
you really?
We did 9 of them.
Years?
And since then, you've done 98, 99, 2000, 2001, and hopefully we'll do 2002.
And and there's a very good reason for that, because these are our friends and neighbors. Farmers are the salt of the earth every time we go in there. And if you were to take portions of all those shows and put them together, you would be able to trace a little bit of the history of farming over the last 10 years in the North Country. Some of the stories are not very pleasant stories, but I never cease to be amazed how these guys survive and what they have to do to survive.
Yeah, we do a couple of shows a year pertaining to farming, and I'm hoping this year that there's a couple of the larger farms that will finally allow us in. And there's one in particular that I tried to get into last year, and I think I can twist the guy's wrist and finally get in there. And Bob and I, as I mentioned last time, on the first show that Bob and I did was the tour next door to my house, the Ridgeview Farm.
Oh, yeah.
And we've been to, Bob and I also did the Dutch Rovers Farm. But people are fascinated by the farming life, and the modern farms are a fascinating story. And I think the thing that drew me initially to wanting to do the Dragoons Open House was the fact that the John Deere days, and of course Dragoon sells Case International, so he doesn't like Jack Dragoon doesn't like that word John Deere. But when I was growing up, W.W. Finney's John Deere days were an annual event, and one of the favorite shows that I did with Bob Ben was getting my father, our good friend Gary Finney, and Lyle Trombley, and sitting there and doing the story of John Deere days, because Gary Finney has this big stack of big 8x10 photos taken at John Deere days. So in conversation with Gary, I was in his sporting goods store maybe 10 years ago or whenever before we did that show, talking about that, and he says, I got a pile of those pictures. I got to dig those out. So he dug them out. And I looked at them. And I started looking through them. I said, I wonder if I'll see my father in here. And sure enough, there was my father and my mother. And I looked, there's my brother Sam, and there I am. As
Just happened to come
3,
across
4
the
years
picture.
old. Yeah. And when we did the story, of course, there were a lot of pictures of Gary. I think Gary Finney was maybe 13 when his father died. And Bob Venn was in one of those pictures I think he was a college kid coming back, just going to it because he was in the background one there. He found himself in one of those
Did
photos.
he really?
We found Celine Paquette in there as a high school student, and so many other people that we couldn't identify, but it was just a fascinating story. So it's just one of these little things, that were important to me as a kid, and I think that's one of the reasons, in addition to the fact that talking to these farmers is important, but it's also a part of, my growing up was going to this type of an event.
Yeah, and Jack Dragoon and his family have run that family business for a long, long time. Jack is, talk about Art Pierce being an icon. Jack Dragoon is an icon in that area, as we also went across the street and took a look at that beautiful new facilities that they have.
Yeah, well, Jack's been town supervisor for a great many years, and that Dragoon's Farm Equipment was started by Jack's father, Floyd Dragoon, and I want to say 1953. So he's coming up very closely on 50 years of that business being there. So I believe if I'm not wrong, I think 53 next year would be the big year for him.
It was always pleasant for me to take a look at the big equipment and to reminisce, because you and I spent a lot of time on farms in our youth. They do it way differently, and some of these machines I can't even identify. That we talk to the experts who show us a computer that runs a big machine, far different than it used to be, and we get to meet the farm families, the little kids, and the moms who are in the background holding things together while dad's out in the field, and mom's out in the field a lot these days too.
And milking the cows and doing
Sure.
whatever else. Yes, it's a family farm is not a misnomer. If you're in a farm, it's a family business, and it's a great business to get the kids with the idea that there's work to be done, and it gives them a good start, I should say, a good start to a long life, to realize that you got to get out there and work if you're going to make a living.
So many of my life's lessons were learned on the farm, and yours too, right?
Well, obviously, that's
Yep.
where I grew up. One of the lessons I learned is don't fall asleep on the John Deere when you're
Don't be doing that. No.
when you're dragging the fields.
That's a good one.
I woke up. I think I was dragging. I don't think I was wheeling. I think I was dragging the fields, and I woke up to the sound of fence being stretched.
Oh no! John Deere would go through a fence,
Well, it was stretching the limit. And I'm just lucky it didn't
baby.
Flip over
Flip
backwards.
over on you, yeah?
So
Oh God!
yeah, that little John
I
Deere.
never
bee.
heard that story before. We got one on you.
Yeah, well, I'm just glad I'm able to be around to tell it. And you talk about lessons of life. The next thing on our list here is Plattsburgh State University's Lifelong Learning Center. And this is an interesting story we did with Janet Worthington and several people from her department on lifelong learning and the opportunities that Plattsburgh State offers. It's throughout the year, including the summer.
It was the summertime that we went there, I think, as I recall.
It was late spring, early summer, yeah, just prior to the summer season. Yeah.
There's so many things that happen behind the scenes in education here in the North Country that we're not always familiar with unless you walk in the door. And we've made it a point to go to Plattsburgh State on several occasions. Last time we talked about Larry Cowan and the sports department.
Yep.
We've also talked about Canadian studies, and we've talked about the history of Hawkins Hall and the Plattsburgh Normal School, and now international studies and lifelong learning. Tremendous things. We've met some wonderful people, and it gives us something more to be proud of to have such a prestigious institution here.
Yeah, Plattsburgh State is much more than just that 4-year school that turns out these college graduates. It offers opportunities for people in the community who want to continue with their learning. So you haven't got to be a full-time student to take advantage of what Plattsburgh State has to offer. You don't have to be 20 years old to take advantage of it either. You can do it even as an older adult.
And we've learned that too in so many ways. And how many people do you know who decided to go back and get a master's degree when they're 45 years old, or to get their bachelor's degree for the first time when they're 35, 40? They raise their kids and get a chance to go back to school. And there are so many different fields of study one can go into today. The future of education, it is tied on budgets, unfortunately, and we see problems in our local schools. You and I have taken our hometown cable cameras into various schools and talked to Catholic school educators and public school educators. But the state university seems to grow consistently here in Plattsburgh every year, and it has growing pains, as every other endeavor does, but it's something that we all can be proud of, and these people who take us to the inside and do these little tours for us are to be highly commended for sticking with it and finding what we call our quality of life here in the North Country.
Yeah, I think we've done a good job of exposing some of the things that Plattsburgh State and even Clinton community have to offer to the community. Next, Gordy, is a little trip that we took to the south a bit, and I found it a fascinating day at the Iron Center Museum in Port Henry. This would be when they had their grand opening.
Oh my!
And
wasn't that terrific?
We talked to Sweetie, Mr. Sweet there, told us about the old trains and that ran from the mines down to the railroad, and that's a fascinating center that they've got going down there. And I think there was an article in the paper within the last month or so that they've expanded it. They got some dioramas going up.
It's really neat because the building itself is historical. It's right next to an historical building, and it is an historic spot because that's where they brought the iron ore, right there, right to Lake Champlain,
and they've got
many years ago.
They've got several railroad cars there, including a caboose. So it's a very interesting trip, and anybody who's watching this is within a day, half a day's drive, or a couple hours drive of driving down there. So if you're looking for something to do in the summer, it's definitely worth the trip, and it's easy to find right there in Port Henry. And I think it's a fascinating place, and we ended up going back there, but we're going to touch that very shortly in another.
Well,
a couple lines down here.
You and I have mentioned the history of Mineville, Port Henry, and Witherby in so many contexts since we started this program, from cowboy movie stars to old-time miners around tables, and that museum was neat both times we've been there, and I'm sure it'll be even better once they expand it. So thanks to the county historians and the old miners and all the other folks who invited us there that day. Assemblyman Betty Little was there and various local dignitaries. That was a pretty special day. It was a beautiful day, as I recall.
Yep, and of course Joan Davy has had us back there a couple of times, and she's the historian, and she does a tremendous job down there, but she's not alone. She is just part of the team, because they've got a real team down there that's working to keep all these memories alive, and keeping the memories of the miners alive is a very, very important project, and keeping railroad history alive. So there's two fascinating stories, and you can't separate railroading and mining. You just can't. You can separate railroading from mining, but you can't separate mining from railroading.
And who isn't interested in both topics, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've covered, how many shows have we done on railroading alone, or shows that included something about railroading? Many of those. And just the stories of how they got those railroad cars there, where they came from. One of them was under the water in the mines.
Yep. And
we got to walk through the caboose, which was restored to just exactly the way it was when it was in use. And I don't know about you, but I'm fascinated by model railroads. But when I go in and see old railroad cars, that really turns my crank.
And it's something that you can bring the little kids, and the little kids will be as fascinated as the adults.
Oh, sure.
Because little kids love equipment, and to see these big, if the Amtrak pulls through your town, or the freight trains go by right now, you can't go out there and look at them because you're not supposed to be roaming around the railroad tracks. There's a chance to go up and touch and climb on and really explore.
Exhibit.
Yeah, so it's a fascinating place to go, and you like we just touched on, you learn the story of the mining, and you learn the story of the railroading, and you can't ask for much more interest than that.
It's the best.
That's fantastic. Next is another person that we've done several chapters on. It's the Rabadoo book. And just doing a basketball game over the weekend, Seton Catholic against Northern Adirondack. And Northern Adirondack is coached by John Rebadoo, R-E-B. And playing for Seton Catholic was the grandson of Clyde Rabadoo, who wrote this book. So even though they don't spell their names alike, all they have to do is look through Clyde's book, and maybe 16 generations ago, they came from the same Mr. Rabadoo.
He's a most fascinating character, and I call him character. I use that word affectionately because I certainly consider myself a character. He's done many things in his lifetime, working for the United States government and spending most of his time in Hawaii, and I hope recovering from some cancer that we heard about in the last year. But
he got leukemia, but I talked to his son Mitch recently, and he said Clyde Sr. is doing quite well. Not to be confused with the mayor who was Clyde Sr.'s son,
right?
But Clyde Sr., who did all this research on this Rabadoo family, and appears to be doing well. He had some problems not related to, but exacerbated by leukemia this past summer. But what an effort! This Herculean, I guess we'd have to use.
Herculean, because he doesn't just read books. I mean, another show much later, he started going through cemeteries. He did everything he could to collect information about the Rabadoo family. And the cover of the book, fascinating because it included many of the different spellings of the name all the way around the outside of the book. Not only did he do the research by reading people and going into his own family history, but he got on the road. I mean, he got on the road and went out west and interviewed these people.
He's done probably 3 large volumes on the Rabadoo, and I think the latest count we had was 62 spellings of that name.
Isn't that amazing? He and Shakespeare, spelling the name so many different ways. And during the course of the interview with Clyde Rabadoo Sr. at his house out there on the Irish Settlement Road, it's Irish Settlement Road,
yeah.
Right? We learned so many fascinating things about his family, and they were priests and outlaws and all kinds of different people connected. But it's hard work to do this. But the man seems to thrive on it. He's written a number of books, most of which are not necessarily available in your local bookstore, but they're in school libraries, and all over the place.
Yes. The first one he did was just the genealogy, and then he expanded it and did the stories, and then he expanded the genealogy, and it's just been a tremendous, unbelievable effort that what this man has come up with. And
people might want to know what's that big white dog doing here? That's Kia. Kia's he can talk because he's part husky, but he goes when he wants something. See that? He wonders what the heck are we talking about? Rabadoos? Maybe he's related to Rabadoos. Who knows?
He might be.
What a character.
From this angle, not from the angle that people on the TV have, because I don't even think he's in the picture at the moment, but from this angle it looks like the dog on Never-Ending Story.
Oh, yeah. So anyway, yeah, Clyde Rabadoo has done so well. He's done a lot of books on statistics and so on, and we'll probably do more chapters with him when he comes back from Hawaii.
Yes, and he's never done this to worrying about how many dollars he's going to make on it, because I am darn sure he loses money when he publishes these books. So it's not a for-profit effort, and you have to praise people like this here, because we all benefit, whether you're related to the Rabadoo family or not. Just to read that and realize what was done, that one family, is just tremendous, and it makes you appreciate your own genealogy, and you can't say enough about what that man has done. And if I were a Rabadoo, had some Rabadoo in my background, I would be sending this man a thank you card every year.
Oh yeah, that's great.
Yep. Next is a story that I think we're going to have to update again in a few years. It was the Clinton County Airport, and as we're sitting here taping this, They're exploring the possibility of moving that Clinton County Airport to the former Plattsburgh Air Force Base, but the airport manager, Ralph Hensel, I believe, gave us a fascinating tour. Bill Bingle, the county administrator, helped to set it up for us, and it was a very interesting tour in and around the Clinton County Airport.
Well, we've enjoyed a connection with that airport. First of all, it's not very far from my house, less than 2 miles from my house. So we've flown into and out of this airport and have never been treated anything but courteously down through the years. We watched it grow. We have interviewed many of the subcontractors, the flight school people in the flight schools. We've taken one of my most memorable but not too pleasant trips in a biplane with Jim Drillette, the guy whom I dubbed the Red Baron about 30 years ago, who gave me the ride of my life. And Kay said I was literally green when I walked into the house. But I've always said I'll try anything once, and that almost wished that I hadn't taken that trip with Jim. But they took us all around and showed us the many different kinds of things they do at Clinton County Airport. Some of the people were reluctant interviewees because sometimes we walk into rooms and put the cameras on people. But they're very nice folks, and it's nice to give the people credit who work behind the scenes, and they've always had a very good group at the Clinton County Airport.
Yeah, it's, as we mentioned in our last retrospective, one of the things we have tried to do is show the various things that are offered in the area, and of course the county airport is a good example of that. And as it grows, hopefully we'll be able to get another chapter or two as Clinton County Airport expands in the not too distant future.
And if they move over to the former Plattsburgh Air Force Base, that'll be most interesting from many points of view.
Yep. Next on our list is one of the few stories that I would say that we're probably not going to show as a rerun anytime in the foreseeable future, because it was done mainly to help promote something that some people thought was very important, and I think it has turned out to be very important. That's the fire safety trailer.
Oh my! Well, that's a project that was near and dear to me because I was invited to one of the original meetings right next door to my house is the Morrisonville Fire Department. Calvin and I have both spent so much time talking with and about volunteer firemen because we have a mutual aid system here in Clinton County that is second to none, actually, in New York State, and has always been a prime example of volunteerism.
Second to none in New York State, Vermont, and Quebec.
And yeah,
because mutual aid includes
it certainly
Alberg and Isle of Mont and Hemingford, Lacole, St. Bernard, and maybe St. Paul. I don't know who else.
Many of these systems date back to the early days when they had open fire trucks going from place to place, and a lot of the reason for mutual aid system as we know it here in Clinton County had to do with civil defense in a time that was very volatile in our nation's history. So that's all part of it.
Yes, so this fire safety trailer is a fantastic learning tool for the kids to show them how to prevent fires in the home and how to escape if there should be a fire. And this was you often laugh at me choking in that smoke.
I was just going to say that's the most memorable part for me as I'm going through this theoretically non-toxic smoke that they put in the rooms to show kids that how to get out out that back door. Calvin's trying to crawl through with the camera, and he wants to get out any door that's available. It is a wonderful learning tool. It was a cooperative effort here in Clinton County for the association to get this trailer, and I can't tell you how many thousands of people have been interested, educated, and entertained by this fire safety trailer because it seems to be everywhere.
Yeah, every time there's a field day, it's available. They take it to schools, and because it's mobile. That's the nice part about it is it's on wheels, and they can take it to you, and you haven't got to go to it. So you can go to a field day in your local town, and the fire safety trailer can be there and offer demonstrations for the kids. And that non-toxic smoke someone with asthma. It turned out to be not toxic, but a little inconvenient for my breathing purposes. But I
We
survived.
followed that project for a long time, and it is a worthy project. For the people who are wondering what all those clocks are
It's 11 a.m.
gonging in the background, it's 11 o'clock. It's a miracle those two clocks are so close one to the other. They're both well over 100 years old, and one of them we'll maybe do a show on clocks here in our house sometime because I have a large collection. And the first one you heard gonging in the background was a Baird clock made right here in Plattsburgh, New York. And inside in pencil is written, purchased, I'll throw out a date, I can't remember, the March 3rd, 1898, $5, or whatever year it was. So that's cool. So you're liable to hear more clocks gonging.
Yeah. The Baird clock, the history of the area, the Powell Blade Company. There's so many little stories out there that should be told, and clocks are something that people are fascinated with.
You know, as an aside here, and we don't have pictures to show it, but we have done, well, we got pictures somewhere, Clinton County Historical Association Museum, of the new one that they moved into a relatively short time ago, and now they're going to move again. We've been in both of those buildings, but I saw an article in the paper about a flood downstairs, and the fact that gee whiz, maybe 1,500 of those old glass plate negatives got underwater because some sensor didn't go off in time and the sump pump didn't work in time. And wow, that's kind of a sad thing. It'll be interesting to see how they get those photographs restored. Those were from, I think they were, some of them were at least from the Schiff photography studios from way back when. But just to refresh the memories of some of our viewers out there, these are photographs that were taken by this studio about local people and events from the 1800s all the way up to the 1930s. So, boy, talk about telling a story of Plattsburgh, huh?
Yes, and that's a good example of the fact that preserving history is a very fragile area, and it doesn't take much. We think things are safe, and it doesn't take much to destroy those memories. When people have floods and fires and so on, personal memories are destroyed. Well, these same things can happen to places that have archives of all of our local history. So
yeah, and it grieves me when I read a report or see one on television or hear one on the radio about some priceless treasures that are destroyed in floods and fires. And we're doing this. We're recording this retrospect on the 18th day of February 2002, a beautiful, sunshiny President's Day Monday, when many things are happening in the world, and not the least of which are the Winter Olympics. And we saw, talk about a retrospect, NBC decided to snag Jim McKay, who's about 80 years old, to do some special programs because Jim has some wonderful memories all the way back past the 1972 Olympics. And they did a retrospect of Sarajevo and brought a couple of the Olympic stars from when they had the Olympics in Sarajevo back to take a look at it, all bombed and full of holes, and talk about the strange sensation they had was transferred to my heart when I looked at it, to see these beautiful venues, and what once was the ice skating arena is now a cemetery. Unbelievable.
Yep, that was the fate of Yugoslavia, and that's
So history, sometimes we can't preserve history very well,
That's right, and there's an example there when Tito was in charge of the communism. As suppressive as it was, it held things in check, and as soon as the communists left power, all these factions that have smoldered for 30, 40, 50 years erupted. It's amazing that the hatreds lie dormant and they're ready to erupt. It's like you go by a place that's burnt a couple weeks ago and you see stuff smoldering just waiting to. And that's how these hatreds go back 40, 50 years and all of a sudden erupted. It's sad. Which has nothing to do with...
No, we digress every now and again.
But there's a war that does have a lot to do with our little corner. And In this one here, we retrieved a part of that history of that war, retrieving the Confiance anchor on September 11th, 1998.
Was it 1998 already?
No, it was then.
I mean,
4 years
it's
ago
4
already.
years ago that we did this. Now, this is particularly exciting for Calvin and myself because we followed this for a long, long time. Captain Frank Pabst is a dear friend of mine, almost since I first came to Plattsburgh in the early 1960s, a name that's familiar to anybody who's ever heard the word juniper. And Captain Frank and I did shows together when I was on the radio when he was recovering anchors off of Cliff Haven, two teenage boys way back in the 1960s. So when I heard the word that an old anchor had been found on Lake Champlain and had been brought to the surface and was on display, albeit very briefly, in the right next to Frank's Juniper boat site, Kay and I ran down there and took some photographs, and I wish I had been smart enough to bring them out to show you those pictures here today. So it was particularly interesting to Calvin and myself to get on the board the Juniper that day, go out there and recreate the raising of the anchor, because they did drop it down again for a long time until they could get through all the historic stuff that had to be dealt with and bring it up. And what are the chances of all the things that now rest undisturbed on the bottom of Lake Champlain? What do you think the odds are against some divers going down there and finding not just a beautiful big old anchor, but the anchor that was on the flagship of the British fleet during the Battle of Plattsburgh? Wow. Talk about historic moments, huh?
Well, this anchor and its location has helped to rewrite the history books because we now know exactly where the Confiance, or Confiance, as the British call it, was when the anchor went down, because the anchor didn't float away, obviously. It went straight,
Doesn't float very far.
fairly straight down. And so we know exactly where this took place. And it was a beautiful sunny day, much like it is today outside. You couldn't have asked for a more picturesque day, and it was probably one of my most exciting shows that we have done.
Oh, yes, no question about it. And if that wasn't obvious that day, I mean, where so many people were there to witness that occasion. There were national reporters there, This was a big deal. There's been an effort afoot for a long time to put Plattsburgh on the map. We talked about Gary Douglas and the Chamber of Commerce. We've mentioned ideas that Assemblyman Chris Ortloff has had for developing an interpretive center in the former Plattsburgh Air Force Base at the old barracks and expand on that. This was a part of that. And talk about golden moments recovering this anchor, which for our viewers is available to bring your kids to see in the rotunda of Plattsburgh City Hall on the second floor. The anchor is on display. The stock of the anchor, the wooden part, is also on display. They're in the process. Many of the people whom we know are trying to build a recreation of the wooden part. But it's there. You can go up and look at it and put your hand on it right now today if it's open.
Yep, and having this anchor, I think, has really sparked the interest that was already there, that was already coming out on the Battle of Plattsburgh, the Battle of Lake Champlain, and also at the same time sparking the revival and interest in all the history around here, like we did this past summer with the Battle of Valcour. And as we know, the Battle of Lake Champlain, the Battle of Plattsburgh wasn't just that isolated little thing. These people marched down through Champlain, sailed down through Rouse's Point in the boats. The boats were built just north of here at Fort Lennox, Illinois. So this, since then we've talked. Again, we're not going to cover it here, but we talked to Jack Bilo about the stuff that went on in Chateauguay. This whole area, Lynn Wilkie and some others have this group from Peru that trying to recreate that group from Peru. They were in the militia at that time. This whole area was involved. It wasn't just Plattsburgh. So when we talk about putting Plattsburgh on the map, we're talking about the region, the Tri-County area around here that was so much a part of the birth of this nation. The Revolutionary War, the French and Indian War, and the War of 1812. This was where this nation was born, right here.
Well, the history of our nation is so much predicated on the history of the military. The military presence in the North Country has been an evident fact since, as Calvin said, since the very early days. And we've spent more than one program talking about military history, because every year when the Battle of Plattsburgh weekend occurs, we're there to do at least one or two shows, aren't we? Huh?
That's right. We hope to be doing those, you and I, at least until 2014.
Oh, yes, we can't wait.
And, of course, I'm very excited. Just within the last couple of weeks, Governor Pataki has got it going that we're going to be working on the 400th anniversary of Samuel D. Champlain discovering, well, I hate using that word, discovering Lake Champlain, because it makes it sound like the Native Americans didn't know it was there, but the first European to view Lake Champlain, and of course it's tied in with the Hudson downstate, so it's something the whole state can tie in with. So before we get to 1814, we've got to go by 1609, which is coming up in 7 years as we're taping this, and so since we've been doing this show for 5 years already, Gordy, 7 years from now doesn't seem so long ago.
No, it doesn't. We're tough. We can make it.
That's right. Also tied in with the War of 1812 is the next one on my random list here, and that's the War of 1812 in Canada. And this gave us an opportunity to go back and visit with a fascinating man, Jean Lebrun, from the Odelltown area, just south of Lacole. He lives probably a mile and a half, no more than 2 miles from the U.S.-Canadian border, on the road between Champlain and Lacole. And this is a fantastic individual who knows so much about the history of Quebec and has been tremendous with genealogy. He did the genealogy for my wife and I, tracing back our families. And this man had great tragedy. That home that you and I visited was a new home because several years before that he had a tragic fire where his wife died. His wife was a filial from the Champlain area. She died in that fire, and also his life's work, all of his records, all this fragile history that we talked about.
Perfect example.
So all of his genealogy and other records, so he had to go back and retrace and regather all that. And the effort this man put forward is another Herculean effort. You know, I put him alongside of people like Clyde Rabideau Sr. He's just a tremendous individual, and in his broken English, he told us a fascinating story about what was happening on the Canadian side, because even though we're so close to the Canadian border, we only look at it from our American perspective.
How many people do you think watching this program now even ever heard of the Old Town Road? It was a pleasure for me to go up to the Odelltown Road, which was a main thoroughfare way back when.
Obviously, that's what Dewey Tavern was on, and that was the route, through.
And to have this guy talk about rising from the ashes, you know, it would have been very easy for this man to give up the ghost. But he came back from nowhere, not only losing everything he had, but losing his wife in the process, to rebuild the house and then to take us out back and sit down and look at all the old maps and outside where he had things displayed in his garage. And
you know, it never ceases to amaze me how lucky we are, Gordy, because as you and I very well know, we don't make very much money doing this show. We unfortunately do not have enough underwriters, but that's not why we're sitting here talking right now, to plea for underwriters. But to have a man like Mr. Lebrun put out the effort he did prepare for us, he wasn't making any money out of this.
Well, of course not.
He just did it for history's sake, to put that effort into preparing all this stuff for us so he could provide us with a fascinating story.
And what a story it was, and we've been back there a couple of times, and we checked out the local blockhouse,
Yeah, yeah.
and we've gone to the sites of. Well, as a matter of fact, we've done some interesting things across the border in Canada several times, and I've found all of them fascinating.
It's an area that we don't pay enough attention to, I'm
Not
afraid.
nearly.
No, yeah, you know, it's kind of been off limits, and hopefully through our show we can help get more people encouraged to explore the other side of the border, because there's a
idea.
lot of stories to be told over there. Another one of our reoccurring stories, in fact, we just did one about a month, within the last couple of weeks, actually, but this one here was CVPH, Champlain Valley Physicians Hospital, off campus. And this was one of their endeavors where we went to several of their off-campus sites. There's a lot more going on at CVPH than just what's happening at the hospital.
Oh my goodness, and yes, we have gone back several times. It's been a pleasure for us to be associated with CVPH Medical Center, because it's been such a major part of this area for so many years. When they first built the Physicians Hospital, moved it from a tiny location in town over there to that beautiful spot on Beekman Street in Plattsburgh. And we've been on that campus numerous times, inside and outside, to see how it works. Has just been great.
Yeah, but this story here was all the stuff going on off campus. And there's so much going
Well,
on.
it's all part of the same picture, to be taken up to what we call the old paper cutter facility. When they were just opening up the ambulatory surgery portion of it. Now that whole building, and we've been back there a couple of times, that whole building is hopping up there and moving tremendously well now. There are so many things up there, and so convenient for people.
Yeah, and then on Route 9 on Margaret Street, the old
Bay Club.
the old club, the tennis club there. Yeah, there's so much going on there. So CVPH, every year we manage to do 2-3 stories on just what they're doing new. It's a fascinating place, and fortunately or unfortunately, hospitals are all a part of our lives. Yeah.
And as a lot of our viewers know, they're undergoing changes all the time. We've had a big problem getting nurses for a long time, keeping the beds open. This medical center has always stayed on top of what's happening. Kevin Carroll, as the president of CVPH Medical Center for quite a few years now, is leaving, and will be leaving within a month, as we are taping this program in February of 2002. And his predecessor is already chosen and will be on board. And I imagine we'll do another chapter or two, on campus and off campus.
I'm sure. It's a never-ending story with CVPH, and it's a fascinating story. Next is Mineville Miners. This was our trip back to the Iron Center Museum in Port Henry. And in this story here, they gathered, Joan Davy gathered up for us 4 or 5 old miners. And what a fascinating story that was, to hear it right from the people who lived it.
We just sat around in that old building that is now the museum in Port Henry and talked about what it was like. And it's not very hard for me to be transported to another place when somebody tells a story. And I don't mind telling you, sitting there that day, I almost didn't want to talk. I wanted to hear these guys tell their story. And one story precipitated another story, sparked another story, and what life was like, and how, it was pretty dangerous business, as we learned, didn't we? Huh?
It's a fascinating story when Gordy doesn't want to talk. So you know
man.
there's something fascinating going on.
that was such, and we had old photographs.
Yeah.
We had displays of old photographs that had been set up there from the beginning when they opened the museum, and the photographs themselves generated comments from those people who were sitting around, didn't they? Huh?
Yes, and they've got objects, and it's just a great story. So it's another great reason to go down there and visit that. And I'm trying to scan ahead here to see if Tom Tyler is part of this list here. I don't.
He may
see
not
it.
be,
I don't
although
see it.
we talked about cowboy stars already once today.
Yeah, but it just within the last couple of weeks, I picked up a book on Tom Tyler. I'm not sure when it was written. There's no copyright information, no publishing date on it. From this guy who, I guess he thought he was doing a history of Tom Tyler and another old cowboy, George O'Brien. And he talked about Tom Tyler's father working in the coal mines.
Oh, come on.
No, he had no idea it was iron mines. He just learned. He apparently had talked to Tom Tyler's sisters.
They said the mines.
He
And
said them working in the mines in Mineville and Witherby, and this guy said, well, he worked in the coal mines, and here's a guy trying to preserve history and is getting it all wrong. So this was what's nice when you talk to the miners and you get the facts as they remember them.
You've brought up a very interesting topic that we could talk about for a long time, but we'll talk about for a short time because we got a lot of ground to cover. But don't believe everything you read in history books. And this is a topic that includes everything from school books. History books in school are very often rife with errors. And we learn that all the time because somebody wrote it down. This is a perfect example. I've read a lot of histories of Plattsburgh, Clinton County, the Champlain Valley, and the Hudson Valley that are full of technical errors because somebody either didn't do their homework or because they read a history that somebody had written 50 or 100 years ago that had errors in it back then. Something for our young people especially to remember. Calvin said we rewrote the history books with the retrieval of the anchor, of the confiance, which we did, because that's another time. We went out to the former Plattsburgh Air Force Base and laid out a grid of Lake Champlain, showed where that anchor was, and proved, based on what historians do know for fact, that things didn't quite happen the way they did. So yes, we can rewrite the history books. In some cases, this program itself at one time or another has added information to what was already in the history book. So don't think it's all cut and dried. Just because it's written in a book or written in a newspaper doesn't mean it's necessarily true. And don't hesitate to challenge what other people think are facts, right?
That's absolutely right. I've come across a lot of things that have been written as fact that are more fiction than fact.
Oh,
sure. Next is another one that's probably not going to be repeated too often in the course of events, but it was an important thing to our good friends at Post 20, and we went there and covered it, and that's when Post 20 honored Sam Ketchum, who was so much a part, even though he's not from the area. He was very active in the American Legion and did a lot for the area. So they had a little day there where they honored him, and we went and covered that. We're we're more than happy to step up and do what we can for the veterans.
Well, it's especially we remember when Post 20 wasn't located in that spot. And we read the old history books when Post 20 was located there near the old Smithweed Bridge and the other side that now the law officers of Stafford and others, and covered so many indoor and outdoor activities on Veterans Day and other days with the Legion. To go out there to cover any occasion is interesting, and especially to cover a day that involves somebody who's meant so much to the Legion and Legionnaires,
Yeah, so we're happy to do it. Next is the Battle of Plattsburgh Interpretive Center, and this is an evolving story too, because that interpretive center at City Hall keeps getting bigger and better every year, and we did a story on its early days on the Battle of Plattsburgh Interpretive Center, and that continues to expand as the years go on.
And if people have not seen that diorama, it would be nice to go up there. Some of that, a little bit of it, has been rewritten, but that was an ambitious project to get that interpretive center set up. to make sure that it's open on a regular basis. And that's one of the things that our present mayor of Plattsburgh decided to do, to keep that open on a regular basis as much as possible, so that people who are coming here as tourists can start right there and learn a little bit more about the Battle of Plattsburgh, and school kids can come in from Canada and from everywhere and have a look at what the situation was like. So yeah, the Interpretive Center is just that. It's had a number of different people running it since it opened its doors, but it's also interesting for us to go back and see what new displays they have, right?
Yeah, and it was started initially by Mayor Rabideau, and as you said, Mayor Stewart is taking that ball and running with it, and it's becoming an important stopping point for people who are visiting the city of Plattsburgh and the county or the Tri-County area.
Mm-hmm.
Next is the Real Property Office, and we talked with Jim Gagno, and we emphasize here the STAR program, which is that great way that we can all save on our school taxes. So that was an important story.
Don't you think I don't fill out that paper as soon as it comes in every year? It's the STAR program is still going strong. Jim Gagno is such a super guy. What a great story of a local guy that's dedicated his life to giving back to the area. What a great guy.
Yeah, he started in that office and worked his way up to the top, and he's been a local success story, that's for sure. And he was one of my daughter's favorite coaches when he coached JV basketball at Northeastern Clinton several years ago.
Well, he's another local guy who's given back what he's received from the North Country, and does all the time, from sports to real property. And that, it's always good to do a show like that, and we've done quite a few in the county government center to find out how these things work behind the scenes, because that's another topic that nobody would ever pursue. Not nobody, but few people would ever pursue on their own. How many people would walk into the real property office and say, "Can I have a tour?" So
right.
We did learn a lot, didn't we?
Yes, and that's one of the reasons for this show to be around, I think, is to educate all of us, because when we're educating the viewers, the first two to get educated is you and me. We're learning all that.
Absolutely true. And our city historian, Jim Bailey, works in the real property office, and that's where I get to see him quite often, especially when I have a question about history that I'd like to discuss. So yeah, nice people in that office from one end to the other.
Well, we're going to have some close counter here with another one that's just around the corner from me. The Clinton County Veterans Office is the next one on my random list here. And that's another good buddy of ours, Warren Manor, and Wayne Evans works in there also, but he's not the Clinton County Veterans Office. He's the state office that's in the same office space. But this is an area that's providing a tremendous service to the veterans throughout the area.
Well, we've known Warren Manor for many, many years. We see him. You mentioned the Post-20 American Legion, Warren Manor out there on numerous occasions. We've covered some momentous things when they took the flag down in Plattsburgh Air Force Base. On the radio, Warren Manor there. When we came back and covered when the mobile Vietnam Wall was brought, Warren Manor was there. So, yeah, the American Legion is very close to what happens in the North Country. And when you have a local office for Veterans Affairs, it's very important to veterans who need services to be able to stop in there or call. They have now a local clinic so that veterans don't always have to travel all the way to Albany to get their services.
Well, this is, I think, is important about having somebody like Warren, who, as you said, is so involved with the Legion, involved with the Clinton County Veterans Office, because he doesn't just show up at work and put in the job. Being a veteran is part of being Warren Manor. So, so these other veterans, whether they be part of the Marine Corps League or the VFW or the Legion or the Vietnam vets or none of the above or none of these veterans groups, you don't have to be a member of a veteran group to go down there. If you're a veteran, you can take advantage of what that Veterans Office has to offer.
Well, I'll tell you some other way that they've done a tremendous service that you're not even aware of, and this is really interesting. because in January I got in or out of my car in the government center parking lot one day before or after work and dropped my gloves and had no idea where they were until I got to work the next morning, and all of a sudden an email popped up on my screen saying, "We got a pair of gloves over at the Veterans Office that were found in the parking lot. Does anybody know who owns them?" About 1 second flat, I responded that they were mine and ran over there and picked them up. One of the gals in there had found one day and one the next day after it had been run over by about 16 cars under the snow.
Wow.
I brushed them off and got them back. So those are little-known services
Yeah.
from the Veterans Affairs Office.
And you're not even a veteran, so.
No.
Okay, we go from veterans to a captain, and this is a story we did with Captain Frank, strictly about Captain Frank Pabst, and this was a great story, sitting there in his office, his elegant office.
And yes, we went in there where it was warm that day, right?
Yeah.
But Captain Frank has a fascinating life and a fascinating story, and I called one of our other subjects a character. And I'm sure that Captain Frank would not mind being called a character because he's a wonderful guy, and we learned so many things about his background and how. You talked about Art Pierce and the great story we did with Art Pierce. Art Pierce's wife's Blanche, and her previous husband ran a restaurant in Essex County, and they were probably the reason that Frank Pabst came up here in the first place, to join them, and decided to come back here and settle down and marry Annie and raise his family. But, his story and mine tracked fairly close together for about 40 years here in Clinton County. Frank always with an idea about something to help somebody. Most of those ideas were a little bit ahead of their time for some reason, and so he met some resistance. And because Frank is not a guy that beats around the bush. If he has something to tell you about, he's going to tell you that story, and sometimes those stories were not embraced with open arms by the people that they were directed at. But here's a man who has made a tremendous contribution to this North Country in so many different ways. That juniper, that recycled old boat that has carried thousands and thousands of people around Lake Champlain and has given so many people a little sense of Lake Champlain history and a lot of fun. The scuba diving and bringing things up in the old days and trying to preserve a little history by diving, and bringing Gordy Little in and teaching him how to put those old-fashioned aqua lungs on and go diving in Lake Champlain, and giving me a sense of history. And some of the trips that Frank and I took to Montreal in the old days, which will never be described in full on this program, but just a great guy. Frank is a good guy. Not the least of the things he's done is to offer a lot of people who wouldn't otherwise have a decent job, a job. People who are down on their luck, who've worked with him down around that end of town. And that's a piece of North Country history that probably won't be repeated. So I think it's extremely valuable that you and I have done several programs with Frank, but that first one was really a good one.
Yeah, and Frank has done so much in his own way to, as you say, keep the history of this area alive, and he's kept the flame going, and now now so many people are picking up on it. But Frank, for many years, was that lone voice in the wilderness out there, and
he was a pretty loud voice at times, because he did some radio shows on WKDR from a local restaurant for a while. And he's dabbled in just about anything you might want to dabble in this North Country, and he's still here, and he's still going strong in one way or the other.
Yeah, and as we're taping this, we're anticipating going out on the lake with Frank and our good friend Gary Chartrand, and maybe Bill Reed Jr. and a few others this spring, and doing another story. So there's more to be told with the Captain Frank.
You got it.
Another one that. Can you call a lady a character? Clinton County historian Addie Shields.
Oh,
what a wealth of knowledge.
One of the North Country's most embraceable characters. Such a good friend. You and I should have that energy when we're the age of Addie Shields, who has forgotten more history than you and I will ever know.
And she ain't forgotten much either.
No, believe me, all you have to do is throw her a bone. Say, well, what do you know about a certain place? And mention a certain place in Chazy. She will give you the topographical history of the area, all the families that have lived there, and she will stand, if you go there with her, she'll stand there and imagine what the area looked like 300 years ago. She is amazing, and I have gone to talk to Addie and so many times when I needed a subject, you know, the origin, why was the Irish Settlement Road named the way it is, and why did this happen, why did that happen, and boom, she's got something for me to read within 5 minutes in her little office. She is a Clinton County historian, and she is quite a lady.
And Addie, with history, she's got. I can picture her brain as being this crowded movie theater, and somebody hollers fire, and everybody is trying to rush out the door. So when you throw a topic out there, she's got so many things that she can tell you about it.
Oh my!
That she'll jump from this story to that story, and it's just nonstop.
You talk about the history of the railroads in the North Country. I mean, she's got 200 stories to tell.
Yeah.
Family names, places. She really cares. And she's working at that job every single day. A woman who could very easily have, you know, retired and gone home.
We talked about Warren Manor, living and breathing veterans. Addie Shields lives and breathes history. So it's not a job to her. It's a way of life for her.
We've been with Addie on Lake Champlain once when we shouldn't have been out there on that cold, what was that, November day? We never should have been. We all got our death of the flu and cold with Addie out there with a little thing wrapped around her head. We've been to Canada with her to celebrations at Fort Chambly in Quebec. And yes, and she's so interested in the history of buildings. For example, the Clinton County Probation Department moved from the second floor of the Clinton County Government Center over to the old jail, and she helped with the history of that day. She's preserving the old jail keys to put on display, and she just got her fingers in just about anything. And when we call her a character, she is one of the most charming characters I've ever met.
Irreplaceable. You talk about Frank Patz being irreplaceable. Well, certainly
Addie
so
Shields.
is Addie Shields.
Yep.
And right next door to that on my list here is the Clinton County Historical Association, and we just talked about the flooding that they've had. But this is a tremendous resource for the area that I think is underappreciated.
Well, when I first came to town, you know where it was located?
Well, I don't know. It was at the City Hall for some
Third
years.
floor of City Hall. Now that wonderful third floor auditorium that our friend Keith Herculo has had such a big hand in restoring, that's where the museum was. And that's where I first toured through it and went up there very often, and had a lot of association with our good friend Helen Allen back in those days. And then to see it move over to its present location, and then to anticipate its move to the Saley House.
Well,
in the future, they're moving some of the items over there now.
The Saley House will never be the site because it's just not big enough for what they have to offer. So the Saley House will have its unique features, but there'll have to be another site. Now, whether it'll eventually move up to what will happen at the air base with
I'm sure that'll be part of it.
Time will only tell.
Yeah.
But the Clinton County Historical Association is a fascinating part of what we have to offer in this area, and again, I think it's underappreciated, unfortunately. Next is some more history, and it was a tour of the Kimpex site, and it included the history of a brief history of the Sheridan and Company Iron Works and the Harris Corporation in Champlain. And here's an example of a company that closed back in 1987, Kind of in a small way, similar to what is happening with the air base, but obviously not that that dramatic an impact. But there was this multi-million-dollar complex where another corporation bought out the Harris Corporation, decided to move the operation to Dayton, Ohio, and there was this vacant building, and this man from Susi from Canada bought the place. He makes equipment associated with snowmobiling and so on, but he could only use a part of the building, so he ended up renting out all the various spaces. And a guy named Bob Morgan, who worked for Sheridan for so many years, is in charge of leasing all that, and done a tremendous job. There's very little room, if there's any right now, in that building, those buildings, I should say. You can't call it a building because there's so many of them. That's available. It's all rented out. So there's so many businesses that are operating in there.
I didn't realize until that day that you had such a personal history connected with that place.
Yeah, well, I started work there in 1966 and worked there until 1975. My wife Judy worked there during that period, starting in the early 70s, and then she continued there till it closed. She was one of the last ones out there. She worked in the parts service department, and she was one of the final employees at Harris Corporation. So, yeah, it was growing up in Champlain, Sheridan was very much a part of the community.
I learned so much by looking in the old buildings to see where the old equipment was located, and
Foundry and machine work. It just, again, the Rutland Railroad went by there, and they had spurs that would go there, and it's just a fascinating story that lasted for, I'd say, over 100 years, from when that humble beginning of that early ironwork factory and the foundry, and how it evolved into a multi-million-dollar corporation, and then Wall Street. Wall Street must make a profit. So,
didn't John Zerlo's father work there?
Oh no, he didn't work there. He managed the place.
He was the big
He was
wheel.
the manager. Yeah, John T. Zerlo was the manager, and
there were some good stories about him walking around with his cigar.
Oh yeah,
and
yeah. I'm going to sit down hopefully this summer with John and Eugene, and maybe get some other person that may have worked in. I want to do a story on John Zerlo, Jack Zerlo, because he was a fascinating person and a very important person for the town of Champlain. He was on so many groups that were important. The founding of the medical center and the school board, and so many groups that he worked on. He didn't just run Sheridan Corporation. He worked in the community. He was interested in the community, and you're getting less and less of that. You don't see the people like the John Zerlos and the Franklin Forbes getting so involved in the communities the way they did. They felt an obligation to the community, and they worked. Yeah. Long after they left the plant, they were still working for the community. So yeah. I don't know. I never saw him with a full cigar. I imagine he did. Whenever I'd see him, he had that little cigar stuck in there.
What a guy.
He'd come out and he'd talk with that in the corner, and some of these parts aren't done here. And so he was a fantastic individual, and he's got a couple of great sons, and I hope to sit down and talk with them about their father in the not too distant future. Here's a character. The next one is a real character. It's the Gordy Little story. Now there's a character.
Oh boy.
And we did it right here, just a few feet away from us here.
In our big living room right here in Morrisonville, just to tell the story about how we got here, and where we came from, and where we hope to go, and my life with my wonderful wife Kay, and combining our families years ago. But it points out that we never know quite where the trail's going to take us when we're a young person. I never dreamed when I came to Plattsburgh in 1961 that I would stay here for more than a year or two. Being a young guy fresh out of college, interested in getting on the radio, making a name for myself locally, and then hitting the big time. Well, sometimes
You did it. You did it.
and certainly never dreaming that we'd ever be doing a television show called Our Little Corner and spending 36 years of a wonderful career in the radio business, touching a lot of lives, but what's more important, having a lot of other people's lives touch mine. And that's interrelationship and meeting people and finding their stories that makes my story even more interesting. So that was fun to talk about it that day because you forced me to remember things that are sometimes better forgotten. And I just, within 24 hours of you coming here to tape this program today, I received another newsletter from the Requa family. As some of our viewers know, my mother's name was Requa, my mother's maiden name, and my middle name is Requa, R-E-Q-U-A. And they settled down around Tarrytown, New York, in the area we now call Sleepy Hollow. And Lyndhurst was a beautiful estate down in that area, is now being refurbished because of a multi-million-dollar grant, and that was originally Requa territory. So to be able to tell the Requa story and the Little story and Catherine Vaughn and Baker story and combine all those stories here that day was a big kick for me, but that's one of those stories that's still being written, I hope, and will be for many years to come. So that was fun. Especially when we got Kay on camera at the very end.
That's
She
a
will
rarity.
never let me forget that.
It's like getting Harpo Marx
You
to
got
talk. Next is another one of those stories we did to showcase Plattsburgh State. It was, I think we talked about it earlier, briefly, Canadian Studies with Richard Beach. And the lady's name I cannot remember, but she looked a picture of health when we talked to her, and she died of cancer within a few months after we did the show.
Unfortunately, but Dick Beach is such a wonderful guy, and he tracks a lot of the modern history of Plattsburgh State. He tracks for a long ways because he knows a lot about the history of the campus. And the Canadian Studies program is so extremely important, as anybody will agree, just because of the juxtaposition we have of Upper New York State and Canada. And because of the wonderful relationship Plattsburgh State has with McGill, other institutions in Canada, and because it behooves us to know a little bit more about our neighbors. Sometimes we our ignorance shows.
Yeah, we talked about just a few minutes ago. You know, it behooves us to get out there and learn more about Canada, and they know a lot more about us than we know about them, and it's our fault.
I love that building. That's one of the great historic old buildings that was preserved after Plattsburgh State became the rambling campus that it is now. And so it's always a pleasure to talk to Richard Beach and to find out a little bit about what's going on in the international studies between the United States and Canada.
Yeah, so that was a very fascinating show, and it's an important part of what Plattsburgh State has to offer, and it's something that our proximity to the border, we ought to be interested in Canada, and having Plattsburgh State as a resource is a great asset.
Absolutely.
Next is Clinton County Jail and Sheriff Lawless. This was when shortly after Sheriff Lawless came into office, and we took a very nice tour around the county jail facilities.
Well, once again, I have to go back into my own history when the Clinton County Jail was located where I now work in the Clinton County Probation Department as a crime victims advocate. The new jail was built and now needs to expand again, and we learned a lot about what goes on in the inside. We saw the different quarters that the inmates have. We talked with many of the personnel and the nursing staff, Jack himself, and other folks. They showed us the cafeteria, and we learned that that's really a busy place.
Yeah, unfortunately, we wish it weren't quite so busy, but it certainly is, and it's it's our tax money at work, and it's all modern, and it's a part of our community, and it's a place that fortunately most of our viewers don't get to see firsthand.
No, and there's so many stories connected with the Clinton County Jail because, unfortunately, as you said, some local folks get into big trouble and become famous or infamous because of the crimes they committed. You know, we can remember a jail escape in the not-too-distant past, which was an embarrassment for a lot of people involved, an extremely important part of my radio history where the gentleman gave me a telephone call when I was in the radio one day and called me from a jail cell in Franklin County and wanted to be interviewed. And I was amazed because this big bad inmate had a high squeaky voice, and it was different from the impression I had based on the story I knew about this guy.
You spoke like powerful Pierre.
Yeah, and we learned during that trip also that Clinton County makes a considerable amount of money housing inmates at the Clinton County Jail from other counties as well while they're waiting to go to state prison cells.
Yeah.
So there was a lot to learn, and we learned a lot about the history of Mr. Lawless, the present Clinton County Sheriff, and I've been familiar with a lot of stories about Clinton County Sheriffs that go all the way back to Mr. Schuyler Ormsby, way back in the 1950s when I first came here to work on Plattsburgh Air Force Base. So, yeah, that was a great story.
Okay. Yeah.
They didn't serve us lunch, though, did they?
I don't even think they offer it even now.
Some of my favorite stories that we've done served us pancakes or lunch, or cups of coffee.
Yeah, those are
Just a clue for those people if we're coming to your house.
yes. Provide food. Another guy never fed us here. Clinton County E911 facility, the brand new emergency facilities up on the air base. And the day we were there, Jim King was out on an emergency. The emergency services director wasn't even there that day.
Well, we were very fortunate to have a tour of the building. Once again, it's a recycled former Plattsburgh Air Force Base building. And here's another story that I've watched unfold for a long, long time. We've already talked about our tremendous Clinton County mutual aid system that goes way back when, and I can tell you that that business in its embryonic form was housed at the Plattsburgh City Fire Department on Cornelia Street for a long time. And that's where my first association was when I was in the radio business. I would go down and become friends with all the dispatchers so that they would know that I wouldn't mess up a news story if they give me a little hint about where a fire was in the old days. There was a much more, shall we say, a more open relationship with some members of the media back then because life was simpler. And I can remember the first machines they came in that had slow-moving reel-to-reel tapes on them to record all the calls. And they could go back and they moved so slowly you could record hours and hours and hours on one tape. Now that's all digitalized, and after fire control, as they called it, moved out of the Cornelia Street Fire Station, and they adopted a whole new name for what Jim King, the emergency preparedness director, does, moved out to the former Plattsburgh Air Force Base. You should be proud. I opened today's newspaper, and perhaps you saw it. One of the dispatchers who's been there since the 1980s was named Dispatcher of the Year, and try to get his name right. Is it Larry Lefebvre? Did I get it right?
Yep.
Larry was always a good friend to me, as was Bob Grakowski and Jerry Silver and all the people that worked there, including one of our sons, Dale Baker, worked there as a dispatcher for quite some time many years ago. So that's a kick, because that is the focal point of what goes on with emergencies here in Clinton County. The 911 system is right there. Now we have the enhanced system for 911, which again is the envy of the whole area.
Yes, and you talk about history not being recorded properly. In the last couple of months, I was reading an article, and Ann Landers was telling people, well, you don't have to tell people. All you have to do is ring that phone, and the 911 will know exactly where the emergency is. Well, first of all, only if they have enhanced 911. Not everybody has enhanced 911 where they tell you. And if you're using a portable phone,
Cell phone.
it doesn't tell you where the emergency is. So there's Ann Landers giving out to millions of people all this false information. Just call. You haven't got to stay on the line. Just go out and, yes, you got to still tell them where you are if you're using a portable phone. And even a portable phone inside the house, I believe, may not pick up.
It may not. Well, first of all, where we live in Morrisonville, you can't use cell phones in this area because of some kinds of electrical interference. But it's true, and these guys really have to know their business. They're highly trained, as you know. If people read that newspaper article, they have certain scenarios, and they can flip through a book and find out. But the enhanced system does work extremely well. But a lot of the pressure is still put on the shoulders of those dispatchers. We have seen so many 20/20 Dateline and 60-minute stories where that system has failed, and people have called and said they had an emergency, and for some reason, folks weren't dispatched in a timely fashion. But this is all part of a network, and it's a network that runs periodic exercises to get itself operating. And since 9/11, believe me, they're on their toes to handle almost any scenario.
Well, one of the things we have learned is that when you call our local, meaning Clinton County, I'm not quite sure exactly how it works in Franklin or in Essex, so I don't want our Franklin or Essex County viewers to think I'm talking about them. I don't want to become an Ann Landers here and giving out false information. But when you call the Clinton County dispatch, they immediately send somebody out. It isn't that dispatcher sitting there saying, well, maybe I'll send somebody, maybe I won't. They take nothing for granted. If the call is made, either the police or emergency personnel or both, depending on the situation, is sent out. The call goes out to them to respond. So it isn't a case where, as we see in these big cities, where that dispatcher says, well, maybe this person isn't really in need of emergency, and I'll wait and talk to them for 5 minutes. You don't have that happening here, and that, to me, gives you a great peace of mind knowing that response is immediate.
Modern digital equipment, it's fantastic, and they have to coordinate so many things. These guys have to know what fire companies are in the area. They dispatch ambulances. They work with CVPH Medical Center. So when I say it's a well-oiled machine, I mean it, and we're very, very proud of them. And we thank Jim King and his staff for inviting us out there that day. It was a good tour.
Yep. And I'll give you the last name, Donahue, but I can't remember his first name. What, you remember his first name that gave us the tours? Jim's assistant?
Oh, Kelly.
Kelly Donahue.
Kelly, yes. Donahue, a good friend for many years, former priest in our diocese here in Morrisonville, for example, and he's just a super guy. And as the assistant out there for Jim King, here's a guy that's ready to assume the precise role that Jim King takes when Jim's not there. And he didn't have any idea when we went out there. I don't think that he was going to lead the tour that
Well,
day.
I think Jim, he wasn't sure. He thought Jim was going to be showing up, but Jim was out. There wasn't an actual emergency that day that required Jim to be off-site. So Jim has got a fascinating job, and we've talked in the past about floods and ice storms and everything else. When these big disasters help, Jim King and his staff are right in the center of it.
Jim King has been standing on the riverbank inches from my house on more than one occasion, or called me on the phone in the spring and say, Gordy, what does it look like back there? Jim King is an old-time Keysville firefighter, and he didn't just accept a job as emergency preparedness director with no background. He's been in the trenches. He's hauled the hoses. He's put that bunker coat on and those boots a lot of times. So he's a guy, Jim King is a guy that should be spotlighted. We could do a whole program on the life of Jim King as it's associated with the fire business in Clinton County all by itself.
Yep. He's much like we've mentioned with Addie Shields in history and Warren Manor with the veterans. Jim King lives and breathes the emergency services.
You know what pleases me, Calvin, and it's brought to mind by what we've talked about on this program today. So many people who are born and brought up here in Clinton County come back here and decide to live here and raise a family. Maybe they can make twice as much money in a big city somewhere, in another part of the country. Maybe they've already traveled somewhere and had a job and raised a family for a while in other states, and they've come back. And so many of these people that we've mentioned today have been here for 30, 40, 50 years. And I think that's one of the things that lends a great charm to the North Country. So many North Country natives who hang around, you know.
Yep, and I think that clock is telling me that I've hung around long enough here, Gordy. It's if you
Boy,
were with
we
us
got-
for the 11 o'clock, there's the noon whistle.
We got all the clocks chiming in the background. I want to thank our viewers, as always, for putting up with sometimes a little bit of nonsense and sometimes actually something that you might learn a little bit from. It's been a pleasure to sit in an easy chair in my own river room here at the Little Residence in Morrisonville and do this show today. Special thanks to Calvin for driving all the way down from the Ridge Road in Champlain. We weren't kidding when we said if you have program ideas, please let us know. This is not a thing that we plan to give up in the near future. We think it's a very important thing that we do. Calvin said we won't ask for underwriting, but if somebody out there has got a check for $1,000 and they couldn't figure out what charity to give it to, call Calvin. And if you have any program ideas, please let us know. Calvin, it's been fun. Retrospective Chapter 2.
And we didn't get nearly as far into this list as I thought we would. We only did.
You're in my house, man.
Yeah, so we're going to have at least Chapter 3 before we get through the first 2 years.
That's great.
And we got 2 more years to go after, so.
You're not going to get rid of us soon, folks.
Nope, we got to. And, it just kind of. It's good for you and I because sitting here and looking at this list, it kind of reminds us of what we've done and what we've managed to cover in the last 4 or 5 years. And
what you've been doing since 1983. And you deserve a great deal of credit for taking, we mentioned a gauntlet before, for picking up that gauntlet way back when and recognizing that there was some value in this. And if we don't make money at it, we are tremendously pleased to be able to do it because we think it's a great service.
It's our contribution to our communities. And speaking of contributions, we're always looking for contributions to Hometown Cable. So if you enjoy this kind of programming, we don't go out and do fundraising for weeks at a time to ask you for money, but we need support from the community if we're going to keep doing this, and hopefully we'll get more of that in the not too distant future, Gordy.
I hope so. I can't wait to see what's going to happen because who knows where we're going to be next time for our little corner.